Okay, let's get started. On behalf of Center for Urban Language Teaching and Research at Georgia State University, I welcome you all to the 8th Annual World Languages Week. CULTR, as the center is known, is one of 16 federally funded Title VI language resource centers in the US, and the only one in the Southeast. My name is Hakyoon Lee, Director of CULTR, and I'd like to thank you all for being with us here with us today. CULTR has created a unique identity around serving the needs of all students and the communities they represent by helping to promote language learning opportunities as part of 21st century global education. Guided by its core values of access, advocacy, outreach, and research, CULTR has gained a national reputations for innovative approaches to promoting access to language education for all students, regardless of their socioeconomic and ethnic background. As you may already know, CULTR received renewed funding for the 3rd grant cycle, and this is the first World Languages Week in the new funding cycle. I'd like to briefly highlight the purpose of the event. Since its inception, the purpose of this event was to bring together organization representative from business, nonprofits, government, and education to connect with high school and college students about global skills essential to their industries. This week-long event showcases diverse panels and topics to highlight the value of language skills, cultural experiences, and diversity, equity, and inclusions for all learners in the global economy. Before introducing our keynote speaker today, I'd like to address a couple of housekeeping and technical issues. First, I'd like to remind everyone that all panels this week are being recorded and will be available after the event. If for some reason your connection is interrupted during the talk, please simply rejoin the same link that you used previously. Our discussion of approximately 35 to 40 minutes will be followed by a Q&A with you, the attendees. All attendees will remain muted throughout the entire session. Participants may submit questions throughout the course of the discussion in the Q&A box by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Also, we will use the chat to provide you with useful links throughout the event. I will remind you to submit your questions again after the discussion as well. The panel will, this session will conclude at 1 p.m. Okay, so we are very honored to welcome our keynote speaker today, Marquis Daly. Marquis is a We Are Rosie consultant who provides his expertise in business operations and marketing for a tech company. Prior to becoming a consultant, he was business development representative and marketer for Cumatic, where he helped scale their field marketing initiative in the US. He's a Georgia native who studied psychology and Japanese at Georgia State University. After graduating, he worked with the Japan American Society of Georgia, a nonprofit organization focusing on cross-cultural experiences between Japan and Georgia residents. Now he has returned to Georgia State University as a sociology graduate student, focusing on urban studies. Most recently, he has been interested in how urban universities utilize spaces in their cities. In the workplace, he explored ways companies can simplify the raise operational efficiency within their business. Learning on his international experiences, he can provide a unique perspectives on global cross-functional initiative while maintaining the excitement necessary to meet the goals. Okay, today his keynote is being comfortable with being uncomfortable. So learning and how it can broaden one's view. Please join me welcoming Marquis Daly. Hi, Marquis. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, thanks. Such a strong introduction.
Yeah, could you maybe start with introduce yourself if there's anything that I missed in your introduction?
No, that was perfect. We'll just start with the title, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's been kind of my mantra. It's been something I've been saying now for a few years. I was inspired by a mentor of mine who came up with something similar, and I've taken and made it my own. In a nutshell, just you're put in uncomfortable situations, and being uncomfortable is a sign and an opportunity for growth, and that's kind of what it means to me. But on to me. So, Georgia native, you said that as well earlier, but in a nutshell, um, my earliest memories are of me being a child watching intense debates amongst family members, anything political, anything on the news, national, global, etc. So there's a little bit of a fire inside of me. On top of that, I had the opportunity to play soccer with some phenomenal teammates, many of whom were first, second, and third generation immigrants. And so watching them experience life or watching them look at America through their eyes, I think was very, very impactful on me. And then outside of that, my mother was an avid reader, and so she made me read to the extent that I actually thought that I hated reading books, but in reality, I just didn't like nonfiction. But anyway, on to these photos. So for me, the photo on the left, at least, is Crook Street Tunnel. If you're not familiar with it, it is this one part of Atlanta, and I would say Google it if you're not familiar with it, where you can kind of paint and express yourself. And oftentimes you'll see graffiti. And Cancer is Beatable. It's just one of those very powerful, inspiring kind of mantras or statements. And it feels very Georgia to me. And on the right here is Lucky Street. If you're familiar with downtown Atlanta or GSU's campus, you'll know it. It just also feels like home to me.
Okay, yeah. Then, Marky, could you maybe share a bit of on your transition to education, work, or your adulthood, or any experiences related to that?
Sure. So I started working straight out of high school, and I ended up in retail. And so from retail, I transitioned into field marketing and activations. And I think the simplest way to explain that is if you've ever been to a pop-up shop, it could be like, I don't know, anime, t-shirts, sneakers, whatever, what have you. Typically, the people you run into are people like me that would do field marketing. And so they're to get you excited, to get you pumped up, and ready to experience whatever experience that you have in front of you. Outside of that, just at some point, I just said, I want to do something different. And so I ended up at GSU. And at GSU, as you mentioned earlier, majored in psychology, minored in Japanese. But the key takeaway from that experience is that for me, it was the starting point, my first opportunity to expand my mind and to kind of have these global experiences or expansion of my experiences.
So what made you go back to school, and how, and could you tell us more about your Japanese minor and your expansion of the experiences?
So yeah, that's always a tough question. Why did you go back? I won't pretend to say that, hey, I was very upset or anything like that. The career was fine, the job was fine, but I just felt like there was just more out there than what I saw in my little bubble. As a field marketer, I got to meet lots of people. I got to experience lots of things. I think it was the first time I had like properly left outside of Georgia without having to pay for it myself. And so phenomenal experience, but for me, I wanted more. So
Mhm.
maybe that's good or bad, whatever, what have you, but it pushed me to kind of come to GSU. Um, yeah.
What is what did you decide to study Japanese? I think we want to know about your motivation to start to learn Japanese.
That's tough. For me, it actually started way back when. There was a time where Google didn't own YouTube. This is years ago. I may be dating myself here. But at that time, there were these videos of Japanese variety shows and good fashion, once again, pre-Google. It didn't have any subtitles. And I just was blown away by this experience. And I won't pretend that I haven't seen other languages or experienced other cultures before, but for some reason, I was just taken aback by that. And I think that's why I ended up studying Japanese. And I will sort of add a side note here that I didn't intend to be a Japanese minor, but it ended up kind of happening
Mhm.
for me at least.
Okay. Uh, could you elaborate more on your like expansion of the experiences about, for example, like a traveling, or how did you get into like a more serious about learning Japanese?
So there's somewhat of a long, interesting story about that. So my first opportunity to start traveling, I went to Chicago by myself. It was my first solo trip. I stayed in a hostel. For those who aren't familiar, it's just like a dorm style accommodation. I got to meet people from all over the country. I got to meet people from other countries. And it just kind of started to expand my mind a little bit. I came back, went back to studies, went back to my studies, and I got burned out again. I was like, I'm craving more. I love learning, but how can I do learning and get more from it? At the time, Jung Ha Kim, who's now retired from GSU, said, "Hey, we have this Hanyang summer program. You should try it. Are you interested?" And I said, "Of course, let's do it." And I was in Seoul. Hanyang is a Korean university in Seoul. I was there for about 6 weeks. Incredible experience. I could spend this whole talk talking about that one experience, but I don't think we have the time for that. I came back and said, I have to go back to Seoul. I have to go back. And so I applied again to Hanyang, except this time the exchange program, a semester-long program, more involved, more classes, etc. And I got a preliminary yes, but it's a little bit of a complicated part of that story. So um, I, Dr. Kim Ryman at the time, she calls me into her office and says, "Hey, you got in. There's just one hiccup. The student that was supposed to leave Hanyang wants to extend their time. However, the student at Ewha, she decided that this wasn't for her. She wants to come back. Do you want to go to Ewha?" And so that's how I ended up at Ewha Women's University in Seoul. It wasn't necessarily planned, but I ended up there. And then subsequently after that, I went to Japan at Soka University. Yeah, so that's GSU helped me do all of this.
Mhm. Wow, you're the very first man that I know or met, a man going to Ewha University in Korea. So how was your experience? Could you share more on your experience in Seoul?
So that's a multifaceted question.
Mhm.
I'll start with some of the photos and then I'll jump back into it. So the photo on the top right is Cheojang Park, and I'm sorry, Cheojang Stadium. I apologize. And what we actually saw there was the women's sports team. I think it was Seoul versus Incheon. We rooted for Seoul, but I'm pretty sure Seoul lost. Anyway, the photo beneath it is the Han River, and then the left it was springtime when I was there, and so they're just constant Instagram ready photos available, and so these are the ones that I took. But to kind of answer your question more in depth, Ihua was an amazing experience. I got the opportunity to really see 20s and 30s women in Korea in a unique space where they were having conversation of general differences. And once again, I could spend time talking about that, but that would take up the whole talk. And so I got the opportunity to really see a little bit of their perspective because I was a guest there. I was the only male in every one of my classes, actually. Psych major, I'm sort of telling on myself here. But it was a very powerful experience. And just touching on these photos here while we're here, the photo in the corner there is of Seoul Station. And that's kind of like a hub, in my opinion. If you're flying into Seoul, if you're traveling around and you're near Seoul, this is like typically where you would go if you wanted to catch like the express train, the bullet train, the KTX, and kind of get around. In the center, none of this is me. I mean, I took the photo, but this is just the COEX Mall, Starfield. It's just a famous bookstore. And on the right here is a picture of Iwa's campus. By the way, very beautiful. Check it out if you get the opportunity to visit Seoul. It's beautiful. That's all I have to say.
Okay, so what were your biggest takeaways, you think, from your study abroad experience?
So that's also multifaceted as well. So right after that, I went to Tokyo. And for me, I would say that I have a significantly better understanding of what it's like to be a non-citizen. There just trials and tribulations that you go through, just the way that you navigate a country is just fundamentally different. And then overall, I've learned to say yes to more things. And so, the first time I went to a jjimjilbang, and jjimjilbang, for those that are not familiar, is a Korean sauna, its own thing. Feel free to Google that as well. Being uncomfortable in those situations really taught me a lot about myself, but also about the world around me. And it really does expand your mind in the sense that there's more going on out there. And I did talk about the first photo, so I'll talk about some of these in Tokyo as well. Bottom left-hand corner is Mount Takao. And so that's just a photo of from the view from Mount Takao. The photo in the middle, it's a reminder of me. Book Off is just a bookstore that sells used books and used goods. And it's just a very vibrant area. And so across the street is a game shop. You can play like coin-based games. And then on the right here is Kamakura. It kind of makes me feel a little bit like old Japan. And so there's just a little bit of that in there as well.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing those wonderful photos. Yeah, as you just mentioned, like experiencing new cultures always make us reflect our own culture, right? Yeah. I'd just like to ask, what would be your, what was the most challenging moments during your study abroad, either in Japan or in Korea?
The answer is actually the same for both. And I think early on I said this, but immigration. And this is not to say that anything wrong per se happened. It's just that process of just not being a citizen. There's just so many layers of complexity, and you're dealing with laws that you've never even heard about, that you don't really understand. And often cases, they're using complex words and phrases that you've never even heard before. And so overall, that was the most difficult thing. And then I think at a smaller scale, at a smaller level, it was the first time that I was someplace where I couldn't like fully communicate. And yes, you can speak a language and be fluent in some cases and fluent in other cases, but there's this deeper meaning and feeling that you have that you can't always convey. And so I guess that's more of a softer major challenge that I had.
Okay, thank you. So what have you done after returning from Japan? I'd like to know more about how your study abroad experience impacted your career after you returning back.
So I do want to talk a little bit more about it really quickly, though. Before I jump onto that, I just want to talk about food, because for me that painted my whole experience, and I'll just touch on these last three photos here, and then we'll jump back into it. So on the photo there on the left, it's being Korean shaved ice. And the center here is chicken katsuni. It's just like fried chicken with like greens, onions, sweet rice, and in the corner here is matcha tiramisu. It's just matcha favorite tiramisu. It's delicious. That's all I can say on that. But in terms of what I did when I got back, I really reflected on my experiences first off. And so for me, my way to communicate culturally is through food. And so most of the people that are in my life are foodies, and they love food. I love food. That's my way of communicating. But the reason why I reflected on that is I've realized, since I've come back, that some people connect over music, some people connect over fashion, some people connect over, reading or history. And so before I kind of close this small chapter in terms of my experiences, I just want to stress that for me, it's about the food. If you decide to go over, if you decide to visit other countries, chase whatever your passion happens to be. And so don't let me just talk about food for 10 minutes and shape that. But when I got back, actually what I ended up doing is working with Japan American Society of Georgia. And as you mentioned earlier, they're an organization focused on intercultural exchanges. Ended up tutoring at GSU for the Japanese section, beginner level students, but tutoring nonetheless. And then I went on to work as a marketer and a business development representative. And then now I'm with We Are Rosie.
Okay, I see. Thank you. So what kind of advice, would you give to the students who wish to pursue or, career? We'll talk about your career later a little bit more, but, career in a similar field, and what curricular pathway or extracurricular activities should they explore, such as, study abroad or community service, as an example?
So, I'll speak plainly and just state that if you want to be a marketer or work in business and that's all you want to do, get a business degree. I'm not going to pretend that that's not the best way. Having said that, if you want an opportunity to work in a global role, which is what I did most recently prior to We Are Rosie, learning a second language is the best way. And in many cases, it's not even the language that you may end up getting the job for, but it shows that you have the ability to communicate with people of different cultures. And I know that seems like something that should be obvious, but in the workplace, it always isn't a skill that everybody has. But if that's not applicable, I would say chase these global experiences. So these could be like I worked with nonprofits specifically that are dealing with people from other countries in different languages. Reach out to your university and say, hey, I'm interested in getting to know people, globally. And there's typically going to be some sort of experience that's available to you as a student. So those would be the few things that I would recommend.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned about some of the resources, right, at GSU, but could you maybe suggest some other resources available, and those are what kind of resources are available, and how can we find them?
Ooh, that's always difficult. I would say that I was blessed in the sense that I just kept looking for it until something kind of appeared.
Hmm.
A lot of these opportunities are actually hidden, but it's not hidden on purpose. Most of these global experiences you kind of have to volunteer for, especially if it's local. And I can vividly remember actually Dr. Jung Ha Kim telling me about a program where it was working with Syrian refugees, for example. And the only way that I found out about that is that I asked her. And so I would say your local community center, if there are any sort of NPOs locally, definitely contact them. And even if it's not what you're necessarily interested in doing, say, hey, do you know anybody that works with X culture? Do you know anybody that works with immigrants? Do you know anybody that works with international students? And so I
Hmm.
would say do the classic work of going to talk to people. I know that that's a may not always be a fun answer, but I think that's the best way because in many cases they may not these opportunities and experiences there may not be an Instagram page, there may not be a proper website. And so go into your local community.
Hmm. Okay. How about the Japanese tutoring position? How did you get into that position? Could you maybe elaborate a little more on that?
So that's actually another interesting
Mm.
story. When I was in Soka University, once again in Tokyo, I was a tutor for a year during my exchange there. On top of that, I was able to prove my proficiency from completing that exchange in Japanese, along with the experience that I had in Tokyo to for my application
Mhm.
at GSU. And so it just ended up being a good opportunity for me. And then there was a spot open there for me. But I will say definitively, if I didn't have that experience, both professionally and of course globally, I most likely wouldn't have gotten that job because typically that job is reserved for grad students, and I got it as an undergrad.
I see. Okay. All right. The next question I want to ask you is what do you think what are the two qualities or characteristics or skill sets most important or valuable for success in today's global workforce? It can be framed for personal or organizational replies. So could you maybe give us some examples?
Oh, examples. Oh, that's always tough. But I'll just start with the the recommendations here.
Qualification, yeah.
I would say emotional intelligence and cultural competency. And emotional intelligence is just your ability to understand the emotions of others and things going on around you. And then cultural competency is the ability to be open to another culture in a nutshell. These are simplistic explanations slash definitions. And then examples of that, working with my most recent employer or my almost most recent employer, Thematic, there was a number of times where the majority of my coworkers who were US based had trouble not only communicating and understanding our colleagues in Europe. And so to kind of give a little bit of a bigger understanding is about half the company was Europe based and half the company was US based. And there were these constant issues of miscommunication and misunderstandings. And I got into my role and just started communicating people in a different way. And what does that mean? Okay, I'll get into more details. Starting to understand, or at least attempting to understand what it is about Swedish culture, what it is about Spanish culture, and then trying to find out, okay, hey, you're speaking English, what's being miscommunicated? And then specifically in Nordic countries, there's a tendency to soften the blow of criticism is a phenomenal example. There's a tendency for a lack of specificity. And so they'll say, I shouldn't say they, my coworkers will say
Mm.
something like, hey, we appreciate that you've done this, consider doing it another way. And what they're really saying is don't do this again. So having the ability to look between the lines and having the ability
Mhm.
to try and understand somebody's culture, I think, which is what cultural competency really is what I would say is the most important thing you can get. And for the record,
Mhm.
I'd never been to Europe prior to that. So
Mhm. Okay, that answer really makes me think about some more practical question to ask. How does one effectively highlight, because we're talking about the cultural competency, how does one effectively highlight their cultural competence skills on their resume or interviews?
So that's, I would say in a resume, it's much more difficult.
Hmm.
In an interview, you can kind of cheat. You just have to latch on to something that turns into another tangent. I can speak from my experience, and so this is not a
Mhm,
catch-all, but I can say from my experience, find a way to highlight that cultural competency on your resume. And so for me, it's declaring a minor. For others, it's declaring a major. If you can, and this is the part about learning that language, pass at least an intermediate level of whatever you're studying. Like I know there's the TOPIK, and then there's for Korean. I'm sorry, TOPIK is the Korean proficiency test, and there's the JLPT for Japanese. If you can pass at least intermediate level, that's an opportunity to have a conversation. In fact, that's how I got my job with Kimatic. Actually, my boss is like, "You study Japanese? What's up with that?" And so we started. That started that conversation. And so that'll be a recommendation if you're a professional. Now, if you're in college, it's a little bit easier. I've definitely seen former classmates highlight their exchange experience. I would say typically semester or year long, less than that is a little harder to argue
mhm.
on a resume, but highlight that under your education. I've definitely seen that happen numerous cases, but I do want to lean into the language part because that's something you can continue to do, further on into your career.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks for your advice. Is there any moment in your international experiences that sticks out in your memory? And I'd like to ask, why is this one so memorable over, others?
So back to another Qmatic story.
Mhm,
I was working with Qmatic. I was asked to come to headquarters, so I flew. Headquarters for Qmatic is in Sweden, by the way. So I flew from Atlanta all the way across the pond, and I just had a series of delays and ended up resulting in me being about 7 hours later than I expected. I think I ended up arriving in Sweden at like I want to say 10 p.m. and I didn't get to my hotel until like 10:30ish. And so I was supposed to do like half a day. And so
mhm,
I wake up the next day, I walk to the office, the hotel is down the street. And what I find greeting me is this cake, like a whole cake. And on it, it said something like, welcome. And then there's a little note that said, hey, we hear you had some trouble. We think cake will help. And so it was
mhm,
just one of those powerful experiences that I didn't expect. Like I hadn't met anybody in the office in person. I just showed
mhm,
up for my first day of work. And I think that that was the most memorable one. And I
mhm,
think the reason for that is that it was a
mhm,
level of kindness that I had no idea to expect, and it was just out of left field. So
mhm. Okay, yeah, that's very interesting story. Um, then maybe we can see the other side. Like, can you describe a challenging situation you faced in your professional life? Okay, and where your language skills or cultural competency was a kind of essential part in overcoming those issues.
yeah, I have to be careful on how much I say here. We
Mhm,
at Qmatic we had a Japanese partner, and for, I'm trying to find the right words to say this. The person internally dealing with the specific account didn't really understand why certain things were happening. And just a little small example is there was always a presentation prepared, and then I had to explain the whole process of introducing a topic and how you do that, and send this email and have the expectation in 2 weeks. And so I could say I saved her a lot of headache, which obviously results in less time for that specific account. She had multiple accounts globally, and I would say that's my most specific example.
mhm,
But I've got to lean back into the cultural competency, just having the capacity and the ability to reach out and try to understand. I think in general has served me well in global roles.
mhm. Because we're talking about cultural competency here, maybe I can ask some related questions. What are your perception around kind of intercultural fluency, and how important are these skills for your, previous or the current position?
I would argue that, and this is just my opinion, but I would
Hmm.
argue that I think it's more important than it's ever been. I mean, the fact that right now I could hop on a plane and fly to Tokyo and be there in half a day, I think it just proves that we're more, I don't want to use the word developing society, but an opportunity where we can connect with people much easier through services like Zoom and various other meeting services. There's always an opportunity to connect with somebody. And so, in my opinion, I think you're going to see more global roles appear, especially moving over the next 5 to 10 years. And so, I would say it's absolutely essential, with the caveat that some jobs and some companies are still going to stay local. But in a sense, if you can sell something, you can provide a service globally, why not? And then typically another part that's really cool about the global part is if you're on a global team, typically you're higher up on the totem pole. So there's an
Hmm.
opportunity for more money, there's an opportunity for more progression. But to kind of circle back to getting onto that point, I would say it's absolutely essential moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what's to the college student or high school students, but you can tell them some suggestions, like what kind of tangible steps can be and can students take while still in college or high school to improve their chances of landing the job that in your particular field. What kind of advice would you give to them?
I would say it kind of goes back to the title of the keynote,
Mm-hmm.
being comfortable being uncomfortable, seeking out these unique global experiences, asking friends. But I've got to stress, go out and meet people. I know that that's once again not as popular. If there's an opportunity for you to travel, especially for an extended time, go ahead and do that. Specifically in college, reach out to your study abroad office, reach out to your Office of International Initiatives. That's what GSU calls the office that kind of does these international global experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever college you decide to go to, if you're in college or whatever, what have you, reach out to those offices because there are going to be opportunities there. And I think a phenomenal example of that would be just my pathway through GSU. I actually was reaching out to various classmates, and somebody told me about a program that was happening during the summer. And what it
Mm-hmm.
was is, I think it was about 20 or 30 Japanese students coming to GSU, about 6 weeks. It was volunteer,
Mm-hmm.
and I got involved that way. And that professor actually recommended me to a buddy up program throughout the year. And that program was matching up regular students with exchange students. And I requested a student from Japan. Ironically enough, Soka University, the university ended up studying at a few years later. And so I would just say seeking out as many global experiences as you can, try to find a way to get connected to people who are doing these kind of experiences. And they're going to start, the doors are going to start opening, trust me.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it always happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. Connected to the people and some volunteer opportunities, they really sometimes opens a kind of another opportunities to join, right? So that's great point. Going back to your study abroad experience, I really wanted to ask, like, what is your most culture shock encounter in your international experiences or study abroad, and what did it teach you?
I don't know if it taught me anything, but I'll tell you my biggest culture shock. And I would say that I didn't really have a lot, but there was one thing that always sticks out in my memory. And this is at the time. I don't know what Seoul looks like today,
Mhm.
but there was this tendency, especially when it got warmer, for couples to dress identical. And at first, I
Yeah.
thought that it was something with me and I was missing something. And then a friend was, oh, no, that's people do that. There's shops for that. And then I went to one of the shops and it was literally a male section, female section, and the clothes were identical. And I would say that's the closest thing to that. But I'd be lying if I said there was some profound understanding, just more mind expansion. The only thing I could say closest to that is just learning the way that different societies get influenced by fashion. And I guess that's more of a different tangent. But one of the things I thought was interesting in Seoul, specifically in Shinsadong, which is this area that's very artsy and you can get a lot of clothes, unique clothes, is that I found their influences or the influences of Shinsadong to be heavily European influence, but also heavily American influence to kind of mix with a little bit of Korean on top to kind of build its own space, I would say. And so it was very unique. But outside of that, there's nothing
Mhm.
I would say profoundly that I learned from it.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Examples, right? Yeah, and then that the area, I guess, maybe the very fashionable and trendy area in Korea. So yeah, do you have any similar experience that from Japan, study abroad in Japan?
I think that's a culture shock. Um, not that I think of, not that I think of
Okay.
right now. Nothing quite as like, that's interesting.
Mhm.
I would say not off the top of my head at the moment.
Okay, that's good. All right. So, what would be your advice to the students who are thinking of learning a new language, but do not know how to start? What's your advice to them?
So I would recommend to take a class. I know that that's maybe one of the more boring things. You have various apps. There's a long list. My personal favorite app is Hello Talk, and so if
Mhm.
you've never heard of it, feel free to Google that. Once again, Hello Talk. But the reason I'm a big fan of classes is because it builds a strong foundation to the language. And I think once you build that foundation, then I'm like, okay, great, chase the moon, go do self-study. I just think that foundation is always tough for most people. And so I'm a big fan of classes. Now, this doesn't always necessarily have to be in a school setting, but I think, and I'm drawing a blank on the organization, but I know, for example, the Japan American Society of Georgia, they offer beginner level Japanese classes. And I'm assuming other organizations, there's probably a Korean organization that offers that. And so going out and seeking these different experiences, you may get exposed to that, because that's how I found out about it, by working with the MPO. But some sort of class, I think, is always to start, but I'm inherently biased, though.
Any suggestions for their parents? Sometimes students are coming to my office to talk about their, applying, going to study abroad, but their parents not always supporting for their decision, like living abroad and going abroad. So, do you have any suggestion for the parents?
That is difficult. I would repeat what I said before, being being uncomfortable. I'll share a little bit about my experience. My mother does not like me to leave the country. I think we had to have a serious conversation, and I had to explain to her that, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. I have to take it. This may not happen again. And I think that that's always a good way to think about it. Is less of, hey, what could happen, but what's the other side of what could happen? Like, my whole trajectory in my career could change. I could learn a new language. I could experience things that are virtually impossible because it's a different culture here. And so being okay with the fact that they're leaving. And then the last part about it as well is, I did go to a lot of countries that have great relationship with the US. The embassy is always super nice. There's never anything crazy where you don't get a notification. In fact, one of the things that I found out the first time I went to Korea is, at least in Korea at the time, you could register for alerts, and the embassy would actually email you alerts. And so if there was anything happening or any warning, you'd be made aware.
Okay, so you share very interesting stories. So I'm also wondering. So what's next? Can you tell us about your short-term and long-term goals? And do you ever miss living abroad, or any plan to learn another language? Or so if you could tell us more about your plan, that would be great.
So absolutely, I miss living abroad, but it's less of the culture aspect of it. It's less of the food. I mean, I love the food. The food is amazing. But for me, one of the cool things about global experiences, even if it does happen at home, is you get these really rich connections, these really rich relationships. In fact, every few weeks, somebody from abroad will be like, "Hey, when's the next time you're coming?" I don't know yet. I'll let you know. Because you share this space with somebody, and a unique kind of, you're from someplace else, they're from someplace else, and you find these interesting ways to stay connected. And so I would say it's the friendships, it's those long-term relationships that I cherish the most, because it's different when you're flying 12 hours, 9 hours, 8 hours, than to just, text your friend and meet them at a train station. In terms of what's next, I think I'm going to actually finish my master's program, continue working for We Are Rosie. It's a phenomenal experience to work with tech companies with my expertise, and see what's going to happen next. Who knows? I could end up being a professor in a few years. I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, could you because you share many stories related to your career, but could you maybe explain more about how your language proficiency and cultural competence related to your graduate study?
Ooh, that's difficult but interesting. So one of the things that makes studying psychology and sociology, they overlap a little bit challenging, is that we typically will have a very American-centric perspective on things. And so it forces me oftentimes to think outside. I want to go research what Sweden's doing. I want to go research what's happening in China. I want to go research what's happening in the Philippines. Is there other research out there that's not being reported? And yes, I do sometimes look at the research articles and skim the titles in Japanese to see if there's relevancy to what I'm studying. The short version of that is it opens up the floodgates. It opens up doors for you to be able to experience things. I won't pretend to be at the level of Japanese where I can read these really complex research articles, but enough to get the gist of it and to quote it in my studies. but it forces me to take an outside perspective as I review a lot of the material that I'm looking at. And I think the most famous example of this, and I don't think I've ever mentioned this before, but when I was in Korea, I took a psych course with a Korean professor, and it was on personality psychology. And this is one of those things. And she reminded us constantly that, hey, this ideology doesn't work in Korea because of X, Y, and Z culture, and because these words don't translate. And so that kind of thinking is kind of what's pushing me forward into my research and my studies.
Mhm. Thank you so much for sharing that experience. Relate to your answer, I want to know, do you think about any, in terms of the relations between language and culture, or the academic, interest? Is there any concepts that you cannot really translate into English, for example, like a concept or the words in Japanese or in Korean, but it's very culturally embedded, so difficult to translate into English? Do you have any examples?
There's a concept, and I have to lean back into the Korean professor. It's Dr. O, and her first name escapes me, but very, very accomplished woman, amazing professor. She talked about this idea that in American psychology, this idea of being happy. But she said, and this is me quoting, these are not my words, but she said as a Korean person, she felt as though that it's a concept that doesn't really translate well. Because in her mind, default is just normal. It's not upset, it's not angry, it's not sad, it's just average. But in the American context, it's being happy. Happy is the expectation. And then in terms of translation, there are so many words that don't translate well. Like I think the best one, and this is even something I have struggled to explain, is the idea of tatemae. And it's just, in an essence, the face behind the face. There's something that you experience or something that you say, and then there's the reality behind it. And there isn't anything that I could say in English that will ever make sense. I could spend an hour and you would still only get about 50% of it. And I think that those are two fundamentally big words that I could say that don't really make sense. I mean, Egyo is another one, but I don't know if you want to talk about that on this. Doesn't translate well into English. So there's a handful of those.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that some words, and concepts are very cultural thing. There are many layers of meanings in it, so it's hard to translate. So I just want to ask you, have any examples? Okay, I think we'll now transition into the Q&A, and then as I mentioned earlier, please submit your questions if you have any questions, so we can have some audience questions. So please submit your questions in the Q&A box. And if you like the questions you see, click the thumbs up icon to promote this question to the top of the list. Okay, so. Let me check if there's any questions from the audience. Yeah, I have a question. How did the female students, I think you already saw the question maybe, how did the female students in Korea respond to your, respond or react to you as the, very few, I guess, male students on campus?
So I did, and I was like, is she gonna pick that question? So how did the female students in Korea respond or react to me as the only male? I don't even know where I begin on that. So with severe caution initially. Um, so the questions I got were often like, why are you here? Once I explained my story and how I ended up here, I think there was an ease, but the initial reaction was like, this is a women's university. Why did you choose the university? And I have to say the university chose me. But in general, it made me the resident male questions, concepts of like, hey, this is this concept of psychology. What do you think about it? And then the last part is, which is really, really interesting. There was an amount of trust there as well, where it's hard to explain, but what was communicated to me during my time is the Women University, most of my friends I was close to said that they felt free to kind of express themselves. And they said that in typical school fashion, often they felt like their voices were less valued or less heard. And so there was a little bit of trust to say, hey, we can finally tell a male what we actually
Mhm.
think. And so there were layers to that. But once again, extreme caution, then an extra layer of trust where I would get these honest, profound answers from my classmates.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'm sure not many people have the experience like you. I have a one.
You
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say every time that I would enter campus after 7 p.m. and be the same security guard, I'm like, yes, I go here, and he would let me through. But anyway, that's
Okay. Yeah, I have another very interesting question. How would you say to the students who don't think they need to study abroad or learn a language?
um that's difficult. I would say to them, if your goal is not to have a global role, all power to you. If you still want to have a global role, I would say some level of global experience is ideal. It just makes it easier to translate. Because the moment that you get into a global role, other roles and opportunities open up for you. But to each his own, that'll be like my official answer on that. Definitely nothing negative. I think people should choose to go in the direction they think is best for them.
I totally agree. Yeah. I have a question probably from a high school student. High school students probably find it difficult to earn money to invest in their travel or study abroad program. And do you have any ideas for them to generate or find an opportunity to study abroad while in high school?
So, in this, and I feel terrible because I can't quote the scholarships that I found out after I became an undergrad. But there are a wealth of scholarships, specifically and less commonly taught languages in the U.S. And
Yeah.
so I know that there are scholarships for Korean and Japanese because I was in Korea and Japan. And so if you decide to do a global experience and you're less concerned about learning a specific language, I would urge you to choose a language that's less commonly taught in the U.S. Because there's going to be more opportunity for you not only to get a scholarship or a grant, but there's also less students applying to it. And so I would say scholarships is the way to go. There are high school scholarships, but in my experiences, I didn't do any exchanges or abroad experiences in college. I can't name any off the top of my head. I apologize. But I have seen GoFundMe's. I've seen people on TikTok asking for money. I've seen it all. I'm somebody that tends to think, throw things to the wall and see what sticks. I usually want to lean into the scholarship part because oftentimes that's free money and usually you have to like write a paper or something, and some of these grants and scholarships are a lot. I don't want to say actual numbers on the streamer, but enough to cover you for that full year without having to sweat or stress. So
Yeah, just to add to, that your answer, Marky, that's really good answer. But, there are several languages are called less commonly taught languages in the US, and also critically important languages like Chinese, Russian, and Portuguese, Japanese, and, besides Korean, there are so many other languages. But there are some scholarship or study abroad exchange language exchange opportunity for those particular languages. So we'll post some of the links of the scholarship opportunity later. And earlier we had a question, more general questions about the what all the languages are offered in GSU. So we are in the the language is housed in the Department of World Languages and Culture. And we offered 7 different foreign languages. I think this question I can answer. So we have Arabic, Chinese, French, German, Japanese, and Korean and Spanish. So those are the foreign languages offered in the department and also, in GSU. Okay. And I have a question, another question. What is Marquis' next destination? What other languages does he want to learn?
Ooh, that is tough. I kind of have a list. I've um I've always found the Chinese language to be so inspiring. Like I ran into a handful of Chinese citizens in my travels, and just the way they speak about Chinese. I want to read books in Chinese. German is just a language that I've always wanted to learn, and then French is a language that I kind of studied in high school, but didn't make it quite to the intermediate level. And so those would be the two places in terms of the next destination. It's going to sound familiar, but I want to go back to Germany. I've been in Germany before, and I loved it over there. It was an amazing experience. I would definitely go back again. And then on another note, I actually kind of want to go to United Arab Emirates, but that's for another reason. It's the photos that I've seen of it, my coworkers and my former employee that worked there, even their view from their office was just amazing. And so those would be the languages and destinations that I want to go to.
Okay, thank you. I have another interesting question in the Q&A box. Marquis has made me very hungry. Yeah, same here. And what restaurants does he recommend where we can find that kind of food here in Atlanta? So do you have any suggestions?
I'm very biased, and so I hate to. Um, my favorite Korean chicken spot, and I feel like this is very biased, is BBQ. They have a few locations in Georgia. I mean, what do you think, Dr. Hakyoon Lee? I mean, I don't know if you've ever had that, but I'll toss that a little bit to you if that's okay. For Korean chicken.
Yeah, there are many options here, and I think we are lucky in Atlanta. We have many options to explore different types of food, like not only Korean but other more ethnic, food here. Yeah, so that's great. Yeah, I like Korean chicken too. Yes.
It's definitely its own experience. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, we have
I wish I
another.
prepared a list though, but I don't think I did. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
But it's lunchtime, so everybody maybe want to know more about the food, but that's great. I have another question. How can learning a new language or going to another country in a study abroad program act as a catalyst for developing community partnerships or global community organizing?
It goes back to what it really means and what it represents. And what it represents is, hey, I have the capacity to not only try something new, but get to a level where I can have some level of competency in it. And people assume that means that you've like passed, you can take business level classes, but no, just the ability to kind of communicate in some level speaks volumes. The number of times that I've been at events with Japan American Society of Georgia, and I just say not even really complex sentences, people's face lights up, and it's immediately you're a part of this shared experience. I think even just a little bit of that cultural experience can open up doors. I think for me, with many of my Korean and Japanese friends, once again, I communicate through food. Just having that conversation of our favorite shops, and the reason why I threw BBQ because that's the most recent Korean food that I had. Very good, but just opens up those doors and opens up people's eyes and go, wow, this person really kind of understands a little bit of my culture. And then the last part about that seems kind of obvious, but still worth mentioning. Once you put yourself out there, once you start having those conversations, you get connected to more and more. I think to kind of lean back into the NPO, Japan American Society of Georgia, they are connected to so many companies that are Georgia based and have offices in Japan, and Japanese companies that are Japanese based but have offices in Georgia. And I mean, there's a long list. I think two of the most notable would probably be YYK. I'm sorry,
Mhm.
YKK. They make zippers. Long story. And then Coca-Cola. And so just those two, massive companies, in my opinion, are connected to JSG. And so the connections are endless.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much for your point. What do you mean by or any example, like when you say communicating through food, is it what do you mean by that? It's more like I don't know, if you give us any example, that would be great.
I can. For a friend of mine's birthday, it's a few months ago now, we volunteered with this NPO. He asked that, hey, I don't want gifts, I don't want anything, just come volunteer with me. And it was a community, and I'm not sure if you guys, everybody's familiar with the Georgia area, but near Duluth, near Tucker. And it was a community that was starting to learn English, and typically from Latin American countries. And so Spanish was the language that most of the community members spoke. A couple people spoke Portuguese. And so going out there with them, having those unique experiences really developed me in a way where I felt like even though we couldn't necessarily communicate,
Mhm.
food is sort of outside of that. And if you're wondering what I'm getting at, I'll get to it. So towards the end of that experience, where you essentially go out and try to connect with people, try to help them with their, specifically kids and adults navigate their life in America, we would always kind of have food at the end of it. And so now my connection with them is really, really strong from a food perspective because now when they mention, I can't think of it off the top of my head, I now have that rich cultural experience with it. And then on top of that, most of my friends, we all just eat, and you don't
Mhm.
necessarily need a massive vocabulary to enjoy
Mhm.
food. I think this is delicious. I'm happy are very basic phrases in any language. And I think it's an easy way to kind of have a strong connection.
Yeah, that sounds great. If I can offer any innovative course next time, that will be Korean culture and food. That will be a very interesting course, and then attract many students. Okay, I think we about out of time now. So thanks again, Marquis, for being with us today and sharing your interesting experience and great photos and powerful stories. I really enjoyed it. And this concludes the keynote speaker presentation today. And thank you for joining us.